Hi, I'm Ian Bremmer, and welcome to the GZERO World podcast, where you can usually find extended versions of the interviews that I conduct with world leaders and game changers on my Global Politics public television series by the same name. Today, though, I've got something a bit different for you. I'd like to share a short clip from another great podcast out there called CAFÉ Insider. It's co-hosted by former U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara and former New Jersey Attorney General Ann Milgram. It's part of CAFÉ's membership program, which I highly recommend. Here's why. We're living through historic times, and the whirlwind news cycle leaves us with more questions than answers. It's hard to know what's going on in Washington and across the country. CAFÉ Insider is a podcast that makes good sense of what's happening. Each week, former Southern District of New York U.S. Attorney and good friend Preet Bharara, a guest on this show and someone I know pretty well, is joined by former New Jersey Attorney General Ann Milgram, and they break down politically charged legal issues making the headlines. From news about impeachment to the latest Justice Department investigations, Preet and Ann bring expertise, perspective, and occasionally even humor to help people understand the news shaping America's future. The podcast is part of the CAFÉ Insider membership, which includes a weekly newsletter featuring essays by Preet, quarterly conference calls, easy access to events, and more. And today, we're sharing a sample from this week's episode of the Insider podcast. To listen to the full episode, become a member, and get access to all exclusive CAFÉ Insider content. You can do that at cafe.com/insider. That's cafe.com/insider.
So the Republican pushback of the entire inquiry it's changed on the substance, right? Their defenses have changed a lot.
Multiple times.
But the one thing that they've really sort of, stayed true to and pushed hard was this process issue of, the process isn't fair. We don't like the process. There's due process problems. Now, I think you and I agree that there's actually no legal process issue here, but I'm very supportive of Pelosi coming out and saying, here's the process so everybody knows it and understands it. It's completely transparent. The Republicans are still arguing process. So we both predicted this would happen, which is like, the classic bully, you give them half your lunch, they eat the other half. Like, they're never going to stop arguing process. Here's my question for you. I think process is an issue for courts, not for juries, right? My experience is the following, that people litigate process all the time. The police didn't seize my evidence correctly. And those types of things happen in courts of law because judges understand what the law is, what the process should be. And when the process has been violated, courts are quick to basically say, no, there has to be a process. But when it comes to the actual substance, people want to know what the substance is. Did someone, steal the loaf of bread? They're less worried about, well, who recovered that loaf of bread by the side of the road and could it have been done better? And again, right. I'm not saying process doesn't matter enormously, but the people who sit on juries and the American public, ultimately, when they sit in judgment, I think are going to worry more about the substance than the process. But what do you think?
So I have two reactions to that. One, you're absolutely right. The process generally doesn't matter so long as the process was generally fair and the government can argue, look, this is how we did it. Maybe the chain of custody, as we like to talk about it in court, was not perfect, but here's the affidavit showing, and, the cocaine was transferred in this way, and maybe we lost a document, but here's why we lost the document. But if it's generally, deemed to be fair, the argument doesn't work. On the other hand, if there's an egregious flouting of process, if someone believes that there was a particular person brought before the jury whose rights were violated in a very serious way, even though it's been adjudicated before, because you're allowed to relitigate that.
Yeah.
The way the cop came up to them, how early in the morning it was, if they yelled, if they threatened violence, all those kinds of things can make a difference. My second point is, which we'll be talking about a lot, a distinction between a juror in a regular criminal trial and the putative jurors you have here who are United States senators. By my count, I think there's 6 senators, and I wrote about this in my note last week, comparing it to the scene from Glengarry Glen Ross. In a real criminal trial, every single senator would be struck for cause because they're all on one side or the other.
Yeah.
They violate all the principles of what a neutral jury should be.
Yep.
They have looked at the evidence. They have prejudged it in many cases.
They can't keep an open mind.
They will look at the press. They will follow the press every day very closely before they're asked to sit in judgment on it. They've taken positions on the president. 6 of them are running against the president of the United States.
Right.
So there's a deep personal interest in whether or not Donald Trump gets impeached or not impeached or convicted.
You want to strike them for cause.
Yeah,
use a peremptory
they'd all be struck. So we should have no illusions that this is, notwithstanding the somber intoning of some senators trying to avoid answering the question, well, I may sit in judgment on this, I'm a juror. You're not.
Right.
It's a
I
different
agree
process.
completely. I think, to me, the bigger question is the American public, because I think ultimately members of Congress work for us. And so this is a very helpful conversation also, because I do feel strongly about setting out the process and having it be clear. And I think, to your point, it really does in many ways take the issue off the table, what Pelosi has done, because she's made it clear of here are the rules. We're being fair to both sides. The president gets to come in and have some involvement in the Judiciary Committee and then obviously in the full trial. But now it's clear that there's a process to be followed. And so I think that's really important.
Yeah.
But to your point, the senators, when I think about the jury, I'm thinking about, the American public understanding
opinion.
what's happening versus the senators. And you're right about them.
So central to that is another point that we'll probably be making a lot, and that is on any issue that exists in the world, no matter how clear you think it is, there's an argument that can be made, and they can be of a high quality or they can be of a very low quality. So the argument about process was of a certain quality before Nancy Pelosi had the vote. They're continuing to make the argument and saying, it's fruit of the poisonous tree, and it continues to be unfair. It is now a less good argument. And I'll give you an example of arguments that can be made no matter what the facts are, and they don't have to be credited, and they would be credited by fewer people the stupider the argument is. One other thing that's happening as early as today is some of these behind closed door deposition transcripts are going to be released. I think maybe a couple today and probably over the next number of days. And they probably will be devastating to the president's case and to the president's allies. And what Donald Trump is now setting up through tweets and otherwise is an argument that Adam Schiff is going to be doctoring those transcripts, and they're not going to be the right transcripts. So he's setting in motion a belief among his allies that Adam Schiff is a liar and will change the transcripts, which I find incredibly ironic. There's a lot of irony here, given that the one argument Donald Trump has been making about the transcript, the supposed transcript of the call between him and Zelensky, is it's a verbatim transcript, just read the transcript. And literally the document says at the top,
it is not a transcript.
This
right.
is not a verbatim transcript.
Yeah.
So truth means nothing to Donald Trump. It means nothing to his allies.
But here's what's important about the committee hearings. These will be transcripts. So this is important to note. We'll all see it.
Yeah.
What happens with the conversation between Trump and Zelensky is that they have some person. I mean, you and I just went through this process because I think it's incredible for both of us to believe that there's no actual voice recording of the call, which it turns out there isn't. Instead, there's somebody who's saying what Trump has said into voice recognition software, which we've all used and is obviously like Siri never gets it right, at least for me. And then there's someone saying what the other person on the line is saying. And then there are lots of people who've taken notes and they're fixing and creating this memorandum based on that. So that call is definitely not a transcript. These committee hearings, there's a process for transcribing witnesses. These are reliable as transcripts. They're real transcripts. So you're right to point out.
There are court reporters and there are other people there.
But you make a good point, which is that the truth is not of concern to the president. It's his ability to basically say, you can trust me and my memorandum of the call, but that other stuff is shifty Adam Schiff. Don't trust any of it. And so he's trying to draw this line, and it's not credible. He plays offense constantly, and everyone should be on the lookout for this, that we're about to enter this time period where every day he's going to be playing offense on something to try to not play defense on this and to try to distract from it.
At the end of the day, sometimes there's devastating proof. You can always argue with lesser ability, even if there's videotape evidence and a confession and wiretaps that show guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The last refuge is always to say, well, that's doctored. That's fake.
Yes. We were just talking about it with the 302s. Yeah, but we were just talking about this with the FBI 302s. I've heard it a million times in trials. The last defense is often they made it up to prove guilt.
And by the way, on top of all that, it's the general practice. I presume it's done here for this very reason, that witnesses get to come back in depositions I took and that I oversaw and that I defended also. The witness gets a transcript of the testimony and has an opportunity to suggest changes if it thinks it doesn't reflect the actual testimony.
That's right. That's really important. And here's one other thing that's also important, which is that you have both Democratic and Republican lawmakers who are sitting in the room. And so if they don't think it's accurate, they can also speak out. So the idea that what's going to be released will not be accurate is not going to be true.
Yeah, and we already know from reporting that Ambassador Gordon Sondland has returned to a committee room to review some of his testimony, potentially to alter it. Can I tell a quick story?
Yeah, please.
When I was overseeing an investigation of politicization of the Justice Department when I was in the Senate, there was one witness who testified for many, many hours on a Sunday and then came back with his lawyer and reviewed the testimony. And before we concluded the testimony, I think I asked, are there any changes you want to make? And or maybe his lawyer interrupted and said, before we conclude, my client wants to make one amendment to his testimony.
Okay.
And you'll appreciate this. Time and time again, the witness said, I don't recall. One reason you say you don't recall is because you don't recall. Another reason is it's a little bit harder to be hit up on perjury because it's harder to prove you didn't know as opposed to saying a flat yes or no to a question. And there's one spot in the transcript that the lawyer and the client had found on page 300-something of the transcript. It says, with respect to line 7 on page 326, where the witness said, no, what he meant to say was, I don't recall. It was the one amendment. And then usually you sign at the end of the transcript, and that denotes your happiness with and comfort with the transcript.
Yeah.
So
I never like the do not recall for what it's worth. I used to tell the officers and agents who testified for me, like, that's not how people talk. Like when your wife says, did you remember to get the milk? You don't say, I don't recall. It's like you did or you didn't, or I forgot, right? Yeah, exactly. So I am always on alert for that language.
Or if you're maybe in the Trump household, say, yeah, it's in the fridge. The milk's in the fridge. No, that's milk. Adam Schiff altered the label.
Exactly.
Should we talk about the nature of the vote?
Yeah,
the
let's
numbers?
talk about this.
So the vote occurred, and it's 232 to 196.
Largely party line with two exceptions.
No Republican voted to proceed on this resolution. You have one now independent, former Republican, Justin Amash, who voted with the Democrats, and you have 2 Democrats who voted against it. Now, if you go back in history, to the extent precedents matter, and they don't matter as much as they do in some other cases because there's so few of them. Mm-hmm. Impeachments are like fingerprints and snowflakes. They're all unique.
Yes.
No two.
I like that, actually.
Right. No two are alike.
I like that.
But look, there has been a tradition of more bipartisanship at this phase. It's not the end. There's still, taking testimony and more evidence is being brought to bear. But for example, in Johnson's day, most people voted in favor of proceeding. But more specifically, with respect to Nixon, so much water had gone under the bridge, the vote was 410 to 4.
Right.
And with Clinton, it was a little bit closer. The vote was 258 to 176. And that included 31 Democrats, members of the president's own party, voted in favor of the inquiry. Do you have any reaction to how lopsided this vote was?
Yeah, so I wasn't surprised by it. And I think that's a sad commentary on the world we live in. What we've seen here and what I would go back to is that immediately upon release of the memorandum of the transcript, the human reaction, forget political party for a second, but the human reaction should have been, wow, that's bad, right? And I don't care what political party you are, whether you're a lawyer or not, that kind of conduct should not be acceptable.
You don't think it's perfect?
No, I don't think it's perfect, and I don't think we should normalize it. The president immediately came out and said, for the same reason he released it, he thought it was fine. He said it's perfect. And the wagons were circled before any other information came out. And we've seen this incredible doubling down of this argument of there's no quid pro quo in the call, which of course is irrelevant if there's quid pro quos throughout. And you and I both agree there doesn't even need to be a quid pro quo here. But it's really like they've circled the wagon in a way that it's a sad commentary that even as sort of short ago as the 1990s under the Clinton impeachment, there was more of a general view of there's conduct that is correct for a president to engage in, and there's conduct that is incorrect. And for people being willing to sort of have an inquiry and to reserve judgment even until the evidence and the facts come out, we have not seen any of that here. So surprising, no. Disappointing, I think, yes.
So my view is, to the extent people can be presumed to be voting their conscience and can be presumed to be basing their vote on the evidence that's before them and on what proper conduct is and how President Trump's conduct varies with what appropriate conduct would be, to the extent everyone is acting in good faith and you have this vote, then I think it's bad. I think it's bad for the country.
Do you think everyone's acting in good faith?
So I don't. And I think that the main difference here between this and other instances, and this is just my personal view, is the level of political fear people have because they see how Donald Trump can weaponize his Twitter account and how venomous he can be towards anyone who moves away from the flock. And I think I've seen some people off the record or without attribution use these kinds of metaphors. You don't want to be the zebra that wanders from the flock. At some point, people sometimes have been predicting you're either going to get no one who disassociates from Trump, no one who wanders away, or you're going to get a huge bunch of folks all at the same time.
Right. So let me ask you this, because I was with some folks this weekend. I was out in the Midwest last week. I was traveling. I was in a few different places, and I had these conversations all over. And there are sort of two groups of thought out there. One is this is important for the country, this is important for democracy, and the process is going to go forward. And if there's sufficient evidence, we hope that that evidence would sway the public and ultimately the U.S. Senate. It doesn't mean the president is ultimately, I believe he will be impeached. It doesn't mean he's removed, but that this process is important and has to go forward. And let's not prejudge the impact that hearings and a trial will have on the American public. Then there's this other view of the world, which is the president may be impeached, but he will never be removed. So there's no impact at all that Judiciary Committee hearings or a public trial will have, because the feeling of the Republican Party that they have to double down behind the president. And so we shouldn't be doing this is sort of the conclusion that comes out of that.
That's sort of silly to me, because the one thing that is missing from, analysis along those lines is separate and apart from whether or not there's an impeachment or there is a conviction, a trial in the Senate. The fact that they are undertaking this obligation and they're having these hearings and they're taking these depositions and they're taking action such that there are people who otherwise would not have come forward. There's all this information that's now in the public domain about the president's conduct. And so when people try to separate this from the election and say, well, you try to undo an election, you try to cause him not to be on the ballot in the next election, I'm not sure why that's a bad thing.
I hope you enjoyed this sample from the CAFÉ Insider podcast. Become a member at cafe.com/insider. That's cafe.com/insider. And I'll be back soon in your feed with more GZERO World interviews, so keep listening.
You're listening to the GZERO World with Ian Bremmer podcast, your weekly geopolitical deep dive into the world's biggest news stories, featuring in-depth conversations with global leaders and newsmakers. To get more of GZERO's insights on global politics every morning, sign up for our free newsletter, GZERO Daily, at gzeromedia.com.